Chapter 28 of The Man with the Red Beard by David Whitelaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 28 The Cellars. I was at first staggered at the suspicion the man had of me. Then I thought that such a thing was quite natural. "Before God, no!" I said, and the earnestness in my voice carried conviction. I thought of Myra, and of how unwise it had been of her to set the authorities on to the house, for at that time she provided the only explanation of this sudden turn of affairs had taken. It looked as though in her efforts to save me. There had been a silence fall upon those in the room above me when the knocking had commenced. Now hurried footsteps descended the stairs, and I heard a man, I think there was but one, creep along the passage and open a window that looked out over the front door. Still the knocking continued. A revolver cracked out on the heavy summer air, then another, and now cries were heard both back and front of the villa. The men of Norwood were in a trap, and in the same trap, I told myself with a little laugh, was Samuel Mannering. A moment later the door of the room burst open, and Dr. Murden staggered in. He looked round him, livid with passion. Then he saw me. I noticed the revolver in his hand, and heard the cries of "Spy! Traitor!" he hurled at me. Evidently the doctor harboured the same suspicions I had successfully dispersed in the mind of the rat. I saw the revolver come up into line. I stared at it fascinated, as I backed to where I thought the folding doors would afford me cover. Out of the corner of my eye I saw Bellis crouching low and creeping towards the doctor in the rear. Then he sprang upon him. I heard the sound of the revolver and the hiss of the bullet as it passed my ear and embedded itself in the woodwork of the folding doors behind me. I felt my senses leaving me, and I reeled against the table, clutching at the black cloth to save myself from falling. I saw, as in a mist, the forms of the doctor and Bellis as they swayed to and fro for the possession of the weapon. Then I slid to the floor, pulling with me the tablecloth I was gripping, and bringing bottles and glasses clattering to the floor. The last I remember was the sight of the skull inkstand lying on the floor. The ink it had contained was running gruesomely over the whitened bone. My faint, if such it was, must have been but momentary, for I seemed to be at once again on my feet watching the struggle between the rat and the doctor. The latter was undermost, and as I called up my strength to go to Bellis's assistance, the man who had saved me from death rose up with a little sigh. For a few tense seconds Bellis stood looking down upon the figure of Dr. Murden, and I, fascinated, stared from one to the other of them. The man on the floor was not dead, but his action seemed to be merely muscular, and performed unconsciously. He dragged himself a few inches along in the direction of the door, then fell sideways, little groans escaping from his white lips. Then the spell passed, and I was shaking the rat by the arm. "He's not dead. See, there's whiskey over there. Hold up his head." Bellis shrugged his shoulders. "What's the use?" he said, and I, looking at the man on the floor, echoed his query. Murden had rolled over on his back, his knees drawn up, his glazing eyes showing like dull pools in his grey face. The hands thrown out on either side of him lay palms uppermost, and as I looked the fingers of one of them opened and shut spasmodically, then lay quiet. I knelt beside the body of the man who had sought my death, but it did not need the hand I put over his heart to tell me that Dr. Murden had breathed his last. The bullet from his revolver had entered his body, apparently near the base of the lung, and although there was not much blood on the clothing, the internal hemorrhage must have been very severe. I was called to myself by a touch on my shoulder, and, looking up, I encountered the eyes of the rat regarding me. "We are level now, Monsieur Mannering," he was saying. "The affair in my room in Soho need be no more mentioned between us, eh?" As I rose to my feet I took the Russian's hand. "You have saved my life, Bellis," I said. "The other affair I never blamed you for. Dr. Murden is dead," I added to change the subject. The rat gave a glance down at the body, and in his eyes I knew that he had held the doctor an enemy, and that he was glad that things were as they were. But all this took place in the space of a few moments, and during them steps had been hurrying to and fro in the passage outside our door, and now and again a revolver shot sounded, the firing being, I took it, from the window which overlooked the front door. I moved cautiously to the window, peered over the curtain, and drew back with a cry at what I saw. The placid afternoon tranquillity of Norwood had received a rude shock. From my point of vantage I could see over the mass of shrubs in the front garden of the house, to where in the road a large crowd was gathering. From as far as my eye could reach in either direction people came running, and above the agitated murmur of the crowd the call of police whistles shrilled incessantly. I drew back into the room, for I had seen a man in the crowd pointing to me, having evidently discovered my face above the blind. A nice mess, I said, I had gotten myself into now, and I wondered again what on earth had possessed Myra to put the police on the track of the Norwood men so soon. As I turned from the window I saw that the Rat had opened the door of the room and was leaning out into the passage. He drew in again, and made a sign that I should come to him. I did so, and placing my finger on his lips as a sign that I should keep silent, he took my wrist and we passed out into the corridor. A few yards to our left a curtain draped off a little lobby in which the bathroom of the house was situated. In the shadow of this hanging I was dragged by Bellis. From where we were I was able to get a glimpse of the passage and of the window at the end of it. At this were clustered a group of 4 men, their heads and shoulders silhouetted against the light. They had their backs to us and were so intent on what was going on outside that Bellis and myself had been able to make our way to our curtained ambush quite unperceived. For perhaps 5 minutes we stood there in the little lobby, and I do not think that any of the men at the windows turned their heads once during that time. There were, as far as I can remember, 2 shots fired. Then, watching his opportunity, the Rat made a dive for the head of the staircase, I following. We proceeded down cautiously, my guide going with his head held forward, alert and watchful. The hall was deserted, and I noticed that one of the glass panels had been splintered. Through it I made out the blue coat of a constable, and from the fleeting impression I had as Bellis hurried me past, he seemed to be supporting another man in his arms. Then I found myself, still preceded by Bellis, on the stairs leading down to the basement of the villa. It was very dark below stairs, and my companion put a restraining hand on my arm as we reached the bottom. I watched his grey, shadowy figure as he tiptoed to the door of what I took to be the kitchen, waiting breathlessly as he stood there without motion. Then I saw him push the door open carefully, and after a glance within beckoned me to advance. The room was comfortably but plainly furnished, partly as a sitting-room and partly as a kitchen, and was evidently used as a living apartment by the old woman who had admitted me on my 2 visits to the house. I looked round now for a sight of this person, and told myself that she had either fallen in the fight or perhaps, having an inkling of what was about to happen, had quietly taken her departure. We passed through the scullery, and in a corner of the floor Bellis bent and pulled up a ring set in a trap-door. It opened easily, and I saw the top rungs of a crude ladder, the bottom of which was lost in illimitable darkness. The Rat tapped at the outside of the pockets of his coat, and satisfied himself by the rattle that he was possessed of matches. There was a stump of candle standing in its own grease on the copper, and he caught this up. Then, with an agility for which I would not have given him credit, he disappeared down the ladder. Looking below, I saw a match sputter in the darkness. Then the steady flame of the candle in the man's hand showed me his face looking up at me. "You can see now, Monsieur Mannering," he whispered. "I will hold the candle so. Come." I think my agility must have equalled, if not surpassed, that of the Rat, for, as I held out a foot for the first rung, there came sounds from above that told me we had been none too soon in seeking the sanctuary of the cellars. At a word from Bellis, I let the trap-door carefully down into place, fastening it with a bolt the man pointed out to me. As we stood in the cool dampness of the cellars, we could hear, dimly, the commotion over our heads. The front door, I said, had fallen in under the assaults of some sort of battering ram, and from the hall came the confused sounds of footsteps and shouts, punctuated every now and again by the crack of a pistol-shot. "We can escape this way?" I whispered the query in the Rat's ear, and my heart sank at his answer. "I'm afraid not, Monsieur Mannering. There is no outlet. Perhaps they will not come here. Even if they do, I can hide you. It is a chance only." He moved forward as he spoke, holding the candle above his head. The place we were in did not have the appearance of being much used. Old crates and barrels, broken and mildewed, lumbered the brick floor, and here and there a few empty whisky bottles lay about among the litter. The walls, as the candlelight flickered on them, showed broken, uneven brickwork, on which the dust and cobwebs clung like a creeper. Bellis led the way to the extremity of the cellar, which, as far as I could judge, would lie under the front rooms of the house. He dipped a little pool of grease on an upturned box, and, sticking the candle upright in it, began to pull out the lumber which was stacked in the corner. In this I lent a hand, and we laboured as silently as we could, lifting each article and placing it carefully on the floor behind us. More than once a rat, disturbed in its fastnesses, would glare at us for a moment, the candle making pin-pricks of brilliance in his beady eyes, then scamper away into the shadows. One great fellow darted between my legs, and I all but dropped the cask I happened to be handling at the time the gross body brushed my ankles. And when at last we had cleared the corner, Bellis pointed out to me an alcove in the shadow of a buttress of brickwork. It was not an ideal hiding-place, but in all probability would pass observation in the event of a hurried search. The rat told me that he had come upon it by chance during a week in which he had been left in charge of the villa. The gang seemed to have made rather a man-of-all-work of poor old Bellis, and I could see that, did we but get away safely, he for one would not regret the fate that had overtaken the men in the house at Norwood. He had explored the cellars during that week, and, coming upon this small alcove, had himself enlarged it, using the bricks he removed to build up a cunning little angle to make the hiding-place a better one. He told me that he had always thought that such a spot might some day come in useful, in which, events were proving, the rat was wise. Above our heads the noises of the conflict between the police and gang continued. Now there would be a pause, then again the crack of shots and the hoarse cries of the combatants. It was irksome in the extreme, the waiting there, not knowing how the battle was faring. Sometimes a distant cheer would come to our ears as we waited in the darkness, for we had thought it wise to harvest our candle, and we would say that the crowd were expressing their approval of some move on the part of the police. Suddenly it came to me that we had done a foolish thing in bolting the trap-door. Any security it gave us would at best be a temporary one, and the fact of the bolt being on the underside would point plainly to the fact that the cellar was tenanted, and any search made with the slightest care could not fail to unearth our poor hiding-place. I mentioned this to Bellis, and at a nod from him I groped my way softly to the ladder and unbolted the trap. As I did so, perched up there on the ladder, the sounds of the house came more clearly to me. The fighting was taking place, undoubtedly, in the top rooms, and I felt sure that the basement, in any event, was untenanted. I returned to where I had left Bellis, for the idea had come into my head whereby I hoped both of us might regain our freedom. I did not like the cellar. I have a strong objection to confinement that one who has led an open-air life always feels. The dust-hung walls, the low-raftered roof gave me the impression of a living tomb, and I felt it would be better in the thick of the fight raging over our heads than this smothering blackness. Moreover, I did not hold our refuge a safe one. It was not likely the police would depart without thoroughly overhauling the premises, and it was idle to think that the cellars would escape their notice. When I reached Bellis, I sat down beside him on a barrel-top and told him my plan. First, however, I asked him a few questions. "There is no way out of here, I suppose?" The man beside me grunted. "There is a manhole, but what good would that do us? It would be hard to reach it from the floor. Besides, the garden would be full of police." "But one could get in by this manhole?" I asked. "I don't understand." "Never mind, Bellis. Listen. I am going to wait here with you until the house is quieter. Then I am going up into the kitchen." Bellis gave a start. "Both of us?" he queried. "No. You will remain here, and I will do my best to divert the search from your hiding-place. And you?" "I am taking the only chance there is for me to take. If we stay here in the cellar, it is only a question of time." And I proceeded to tell him my plan. He agreed to it with a grunt which plainly said that he had little faith in it. For a few moments we allowed ourselves a light, and in that time I ran through my pockets and destroyed the card of membership and all papers and articles which could in any way identify me with Simon Draffo. From my note-book I tore the pages on which was any writing, and on the fly-leaf I wrote Samuel Mannering, Mercury Office, Fleet Street. The discarded papers we reduced to ashes in the flame of the candle. Then in the darkness we waited perhaps an hour or an hour and a half. I paid periodical visits to the top of the ladder, and at last I told myself it was time for me to put my plan into execution. I called a whispered farewell to the rat, and raised the trap-door a few inches. The red rays of the setting sun nearly blinded me after the darkness of the cellar, but in a moment I could see that the kitchen was as we had left it. With a heave of the shoulders I pushed back the flap and emerged, a dust-grimed figure, into the basement. I stood for a moment in indecision, keeping well back from the window. Every now and again a shadow would pass across the panes, telling me that the garden was occupied, presumably by police, put there to see that no one left the house. I looked at the cheap American clock which was ticking on the mantelpiece, and saw that it wanted 20 minutes to 8. It would be better for my purpose to wait until it grew a little darker, and I took my seat on a Windsor chair, screening myself behind the scullery door. I waited there till between 7:15 and 8:30. The fighting had ceased long since. the only sounds which reached me being the occasional tread of footsteps crossing the room above me, and the distant murmur of voices. It was by this time much darker, and shadows filled the corners of the great kitchen. Treading lightly, I walked upstairs into the hall. Here all was quiet, but through the slightly open door of the back room I could see an inspector of police writing at a table, and from the voices I took it that there were 3 or 4 men in the room with him. As I stood there at the head of the stairs, someone came from the room at the front and, seeing me, gave a gasp. I caught sight of myself in a mirror a little later, and I can understand the consternation I must have struck into the heart of a sudden beholder. The man, he was a constable, and he showed signs of the fight he had been through, made a grab at my shoulder, at the same time calling to his comrades in the other room, who came running at his voice. Together they dragged me in and stood me before the inspector whom I had seen writing. "When you've quite done," I began. "You are English?" the remark was shot at me by the inspector. I bowed with a little smile. "At your service," I said. "Mr. Samuel Mannering, of the Mercury. Really, you shouldn't knock the press about like this. Is Sir Andrew here?" At my mention of the chief at the yard, the manner of the man at the table underwent a change. He was still undecided, however, how to act. "That's all very well, Mr. Mannering, but the house is surrounded. How did you—" "You underrate us newspaper men," I said. "There's a manhole at the back. Coals, I think it's for. But it does for reporters at a pinch. Rather a tight pinch, too, it was." The inspector frowned slightly. "But the garden is watched," I said. "So I saw as I came through, Mr. Inspector." There was a little laugh at this, and I saw my case was as good as won. "I came through the cellars," I added, and pointed to the cobwebs on my clothes. "The cellars?" "Yes. Didn't you see a trapdoor arrangement in the scullery?" "We hadn't made a strict search yet. We're waiting for Sir Andrew, who has gone back to the yard. He's motoring, so he may be here at any moment. Then he'll remove the last lingering doubt as to the identity of Mr. Samuel Mannering. Do these infernal anarchists keep whisky in the house? I'm dry as dust, and there are a lot of empties in the cellar." The inspector seemed struck by an idea. "Nothing else in the cellar, I suppose, Mr. Mannering?" "Meaning?" I asked blandly. "Any of the fellows we have been after. There's 4 dead and 2 prisoners, so far." "Oh, I see. No, you can cut out the cellars from your reckoning. I was there the best part of an hour looking for the way up into the house. There's no one there." And I took a cigarette from my case and lit it so that the inspector should not see my eyes. I stayed with the men in that room for nearly an hour longer, but it was little in the way of information that I could gather. The order from headquarters as to pressmen had evidently been made plain. Moreover, I do not imagine that until Sir Andrew Fordman arrived, I was quite taken at my word. When at last a motor drove up to the gate and the white-bearded chief entered, it was plain sailing. I had during my journalistic career often come in touch with Sir Andrew, and, indeed, before he reached the top of the tree I had, on occasions, been of some slight assistance to him in the working up of a case. He greeted me in a friendly manner, although I could see he was very preoccupied with the magnitude of the events which had been happening that evening. He listened to the story of my forced entrance with a smile. "Like old times, Mr. Mannering, to have you on the spot," he said. "You've been out of the game lately, eh?" "Somewhat," I said. "I've been abroad. Manchuria. I'll tell you later. Now, am I to be let in on this job, Sir Andrew?" For a moment I thought he was going to refuse. He fingered his beard and seemed to be weighing pros and cons. "As you're here, Mr. Mannering, you may as well stay. You've been to Russia, eh? Perhaps you'll be useful in our search." And so, by great good luck, the only journalist who was allowed to accompany the party who made an examination of Clarina Villa was Mr. Samuel Mannering, of the Mercury. End of chapter 28.